So,
Somebody.
Hello, this is Ana Jimenez, the Spanish interpreter.
hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but your voice is a bit faint. Mapping in different contexts. We're going to see case studies of FSP mapping in Yemen, Somalia, and Uganda. And then we'll also have a brief Q&A session after that, and then have an FSP perspective on the mapping itself, and just to get an FSP perspective on the mapping itself, and then also now go to the Q&A session briefly, and then do a wrap up. So right before we start, I just like to get to know who is in the room. So we're just going to launch a brief poll so that you can be able to interact. We just want to find out who is in the room. Kindly, Esther, share the poll. Yeah, you can just go ahead and fill in the poll. Just like to know also which organization do you work for, and also if your cash working group has conducted any FSP mapping before. Yeah, thank you so much. I see the answers are coming in. Yeah, see we are still at 20%. They're coming in, continue. We'll give it like, I think, 1 more minute just to get your responses. Yeah, I think we are at 60%. I'll just give you more time to fill, just 30 more seconds. We are at 70%, just 20 more seconds, kindly fill in. Yes. So I see so far we have a good number of participants spread all across the globe, from Africa to Asia, Europe, North America, and even Latin America. We have some very hardworking colleagues waking up very early to tune in for this webinar. Thank you so much. And in regards to the organization, we have a good number of international organizations, private sector. We also have national organizations also represented here, and also donors. In regards to the FSP mapping, how many have done has your cash working group conducted an FSP mapping before? I see 48% say yes, 52% say no. So I think it's very interesting, these statistics, and I think that's why we are here. We can be able to get to understand more about financial service provider mapping. And Yorgos from CALP Network will kick us and just set the tone and just give us an overview of FSP mapping and why is it necessary, and how do you proceed with this so far. So welcome, Yorgos. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dennis. So good morning and good afternoon, dear colleagues. My name is Yorgos, and I am the regional representative of CALP Network for the Middle East and North Africa regions and areas. And once again, welcome to this webinar. So cash and vouchers assistance is a multifaceted mechanism that requires engaging not only with the humanitarian sector, but also with a much larger and diverse group of stakeholders. So within the diverse group, the financial sector and financial service providers play a very big role in many of the responses that we're dealing with, and naturally in all cash and voucher assistance programs. So next slide, please. So today I would like to very briefly open the discussion by going over some very basic but important notions that concern CVA and financial service providers. And that is, first, talk a little bit of what is an FSP map and why it's important on CVA programming. Then second, I will touch a bit on some elements that play a crucial role for creating a good FSP map. And last but not least, I will touch on one important of those elements that CALP is emphasizing also through our new strategy that aims for collective action, and that is collaborative approaches. So we could achieve more results through this FSP map. So what is an FSP, dear colleagues? An FSP mapping is basically an exercise that provides to the humanitarian actors and to non-humanitarian actors with answers that are related to the following components. First, it covers the financial service providers' presence and geographical coverage to the areas we want to examine. Then the available existing financial service provider service to the areas that we want to cover. Then the operational capacities, but also the capabilities of those financial service providers. Equally important in such assessments is to cover and examine legal considerations that abide those providers, but also the wider context that these financial service providers operate in, and usually are in countries that are regulated, but also requirements for them to operate. Usually also, most of the time, an FSP assessment covers the wider financial ecosystem that characterizes those areas, but also its status, meaning its health. And last but not least, a lot of focus should be put in place to examine the characteristics of the recipients or the people who are accessing those financial service providers and their preferences. So in essence, an FSP maps helps assessing operational and programmatic challenges which are associated with different delivery mechanisms and potentially also mitigation measures, but also on the other side, tries to assess the familiarity of affected populations with the delivery of mechanisms, the FSPs. So again, why is this FSP mapping necessary? We are all aware, dear colleagues, of the different complexities of the context that are being characterized these days. We all have worked, or most of us have worked in difficult contexts, and we know how difficult it is to navigate in this context. So that is why a thorough understanding of our landscape can help us to navigate or readapt our strategies and approaches when we are designing and when we are adapting our CVA programs. So that is why I repeat, such an exercise is crucial and can present feasible and available mechanisms and can improve program design. It can improve reach and access of communities geographically, but also can help us understand social and legal elements and throw light on considerations that honestly, those who are in the room and have conducted FSP, might throw considerations on aspects that we had no idea that they were on the table. Moreover, I would like to highlight I intentionally put information sharing and coordination, because after this assessment, this mapping is concluded, it is very crucial that the information is shared as widely as possible with all relevant stakeholders, again, humanitarian and non-humanitarian, and including the local actors. And in case the cash working group do not lead that, it should be shared with the cash working groups as well, so that we can collectively develop better responses. It's as simple as that, that are relevant and effective and built on inclusive engagement with communities, the private sector, and the markets. And last but not least, in order to achieve the best results, after the information sharing, the strong coordination among all relevant actors is very crucial and important to ensure, again, that all efforts will result in our overall objective, which is naturally to improve reach and access of the communities to cash and vouchers assistance. So next slide, please. So what are the elements from our experience for a successful financial service provider mapping? First and foremost is inclusive dialogue. We need to have multiple channels to engage with different stakeholders in order to have a holistic view on of the landscape that we are dealing with. And it is no surprise that we need to engage and have constructive dialogue with the communities. We need to have constructive dialogue with the humanitarian organizations, not only for them to provide access and support in the assessment, but also as key informants. And naturally, the financial service providers, the private ones, but also the governmentals. Second, and this is also highlighted, is that we need to understand thoroughly from all aspects the financial service providers' perspectives. It means not only just mapping and just shallow examining. We need to go and engage with them and be recipient to their advice, but also try to understand, to have an in-depth understanding of the framework they operate, the regulatory, the formal and the informal, and again, the infrastructures that they operate, both formal and informal. But then also try to have a transparent dialogue in terms to what is feasible when it comes to action and how humanitarian actors can adapt or readapt their strategies or their actions to make accessibility as better as possible. Third, again, once again, from our experience, cross-regional experience and understanding, acquiring best practices from different countries and coordination structures or entities that have developed such assessments is crucial. It's important to understand how such FSP mappings have been developed and created in different countries, and my colleague Nisa will be able also to develop a little bit that further. At last but not least, as I told you, CALP network emphasizes on it, enhancing collaborative approaches. With that being said, Chris, if you can move to my last slide, I would like to give a latest example that CALP has of an FSP mapping that CALP has developed collaboratively with the Cash and Market Working Group of Yemen, and having Reach as the lead research team for this assessment. I would like to very briefly outline and emphasize that in this effort, this was an effort that multiple set of actors were involved, and as a result, the results were maximized, embraced, and also shared by many of the participants or humanitarian actors on the ground. And just to outline, give an example of how a collaborative approach could could be in such mappings. First, we created a steering committee. That steering committee conducted an inception meetings to understand what we want to achieve. This steering committee was comprised of different experts that are related to financial service providers, but mainly in the country, but also international experts, so that they could help navigate this research and provide as best possible expertise on the topic. We even focused on selecting the researcher, in that case was Rich, and was able to provide guidance and strategic support throughout the implementation. Second, Rich, which was the selected researcher, was able to drive forward this research, but at the same time collaborate closely with all the involved stakeholders. And last but not least, the Cash and Market Working Group. First, the Cash and Market Working Group leads, which were also participating and leading also many parts of the same committee, advising and supporting all teams and mainly the research team. And at the same time, members of the Cash and Market Working Group that also provided willingly their human resources to collect data, also to participate at key informants. And last but not least, support with the networking and providing contacts, relevant contacts to anyone that was leading any activities in the overall FSP mapping exercise. So with that being said, Dennis, my presentation comes to an end. And after my presentation, my colleague Nisa from Reach, that has been one of the leaders of the Yemen FSP study, will take us through more analytically on what happened and how this FSP mapping was developed. Over, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yorgos, for that. I think it was very interesting to see the different elements of what makes a successful FSP mapping. And just to highlight also on it's very interesting to see the collaborative approach that you took to ensure it is as participatory as possible. So thank you so much. I just want to highlight that if you joined us a bit late, you can be able to get the translation for this webinar by hitting on the interpretation button right below there. You can be able to find the interpretation button where you can get this, listen in this webinar in different languages, French, Arabic, and Spanish. I just like to thank you so much, Yorgos, for setting the tone. And at this point, I'd just like to invite Nisa, who's going to delve deeper into the FSP, financial service provider and cash voucher assessment in Yemen. And just to give us more insights on the approaches and some of the lessons learned and how we can be able to learn more on this. And in the meantime, kindly put your questions on the Q&S chat so that we can be able to answer them when we get to the Q&A session. Kindly go ahead, Nisa.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Sorry, Dennis, can I go ahead and share my own screen? Dennis?
Yeah. We
Sorry,
have
can I go ahead and share my own screen?
It's already shared on the presentation. It's already shared on the. Can you be able to see it?
Okay, sure. Okay, thank you. So I'll be talking about the CVA FSP assessment that we did on behalf of that I did with Breach and my other colleagues. So I was asked to mainly approach it from a bit of a technical point of view. So I'll be going over the methodology that we used and also how these methodological approaches kind of informed the findings that we had. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this research was conducted in April and May last year. And the main objectives were to inform to identify operational and potential delivery mechanisms for cash and voucher assistance, to identify financial service providers and their capacity and experience in facilitating CVA in Yemen, and to assess operational and programmatic challenges with each delivery mechanism and also their potential mitigation methods. And fourthly, there was a component in which we assessed the familiarity of affected populations, their familiarity with delivery mechanisms and which FSPs. Next slide, please. So the methodology that we used was a bit of a mixed method approach. So we used qualitative as well as quantitative methods in 4 different surveys. So the first survey was a quantitative key informant interview with affected populations. There were about 112 interviews held, not by Reach, but instead we trained implementing partners to conduct the key informant interviews for us. And then secondly, there was a qualitative key informant interview with FSPs and also a qualitative key informant interview with humanitarian organizations, both of which were conducted remotely by Reach, and they were semi-structured interviews. And the fourth aspect was a quantitative self-administrated survey. So a survey that humanitarian organizations could fill out independently, and it was circulated by the Cash and Market Working Group. And thank you. Now I will just talk about, for each different method, kind of trying to highlight what were the pros and the cons and what we learned from these methodologies. Firstly, for the quantitative semi-structured interviews, these were kind of like very thorough conversations we had of like 1 or 2 hours with FSPs and humanitarian organizations, and they allowed us to really listen deeply, so we could uncover mechanisms within delivery we could uncover differences within delivery mechanisms, and in that way we were able to highlight best practices and how approaches differ, which I don't think we would be able to materialize if it was a quantitative approach. And also it allowed us to clarify CVA definitions, because they can sometimes be a bit multi-interpretable. So during these dialogues we can ask FSPs or humanitarian organizations to define what they're actually talking about. And the conversational style that we used was quite useful to establish a relationship with FSPs, and also to really learn from the FSP's experience and perspectives on CVA in Yemen. But on the other hand, it was quite a, oh, can we go back? Sorry. Yeah, thank you. On the other hand, it was quite a time-intensive methodology, and there were no clear answers about fees and liquidity from the FSPs, but potentially we can solve that through humanitarian interviews, but I'll talk about that in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, then the quantitative interviews that were held with community key informants. They were quite useful because they allowed for a comparison between context and experiences. So we could easily compare between urban and rural findings and IDPs and host community findings, and it was easy and quick to implement. And thirdly, maybe also to mention that because we included humanitarian organizations that collected data for us, they became stakeholders in the process, and also we could easily ask these organizations then for contextual information. So we consult them for information whenever needed. But on the other hand, I think another potential mechanism would be focus groups, which we unfortunately didn't do, but which would kind of help to understand the why question. So why do communities prefer a delivery mechanism and dislike another? And I think another challenge that we face is that there's quite some confusion, as I said, at least that we experienced, between CVA terms and concepts. And within this methodology, we couldn't easily clarify things because between us and the KIs, there were a bunch of other actors. And apart from having to define these terms, it would also be useful to culturally embed or check for the cultural relevancy of the terms, because when we analyze the data, sometimes we realize that there was one point where we noticed that our definition of a bank is quite different than the definition of a key informant in Yemen. Formal financial institutions like banks are not as integrated in Yemen. So when the KIs talked about banks, they usually refer to any kind of FSP and not specifically to a bank. So that was quite a lesson learned. And next slide, please. Thank you. So this self-administrated survey that we did was intended as a 4W. So who does what, when, and where of CVA in Yemen. And it was also intended to provide information on FSPs. So I think in this way, if you don't have any capacity to interview FSPs, you could also obtain a lot of information about FSPs via the humanitarian organizations. And for us particularly, we also use this because we thought we could check findings between FSPs and humanitarian organizations. But these were nice ideas, but unfortunately they didn't really work out because we had very limited participation in this survey. Lesson learned was, I think, that the survey was too long and we could have communicated better why we were asking people to dedicate their time to fill in that survey. So we could have asked them why, we could have been more clearer explaining that we wanted to create this 4W system and how that would benefit the participants. Next slide, please. This is basically highlighting what Georges also said. I think for us, the fact that it was a participatory process, which included different perspectives and also different actors that contributed, really made the findings more like deep and rich. Basically, every actor contributed through their own, with their own comparative advantage of what they're best in, right? So you had CALP and the steering committee that has the latest knowledge of the CVA field, and they were quite contributory because they read our drafts, for example. There was REACH that does the research, the Cash and Market Working Group that contributed through their network, and the implementing organizations that contributed by supporting in data collection and providing connections with the FSPs, and also by participating in SAKI themselves. I think one thing that we could have improved on is to have more accountability to the humanitarian organizations. So, for example, have in structured monitoring and evaluation in which we would assess if the findings or the research objectives of the report kind of also met the information needs of humanitarian organizations. So that was a maybe lesson learned. Next slide, please. As a conclusion, some of the lessons learned is to have a participatory assessment using a methodology that best suits the research goals, and also is adaptive and responsive to the resources that you have at hand, and adopt a clear-cut, unambiguous, and maybe also culturally embedded glossary of CVA terms. And that was all for me. Maybe next slide. Okay, thank you for your attention, and back to you, Dennis.
Okay, thank you so much, Nisa, for that. Just taking us through the technical approaches that you undertook when taking the financial service provider assessment in Yemen. And I can see quite a number of questions. However, kindly just allow us to go to the next presentation, and then we take questions after that, so that we can allow the next presenter to present, and then we take questions after that. Thank you so much. Over to Francesca, who is the Somalia Cash Working Group co-chair, and also the program coordinator for the Somalia Cash Consortium. So welcome, Francesca. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks, everyone. Next slide, please. So a very brief overview on the financial service provider mapping that we did in Somalia. Of course, in terms of vision, it was the capacity to support cash transfer organization to deliver cash transfer in
Francesca, are you still there? Francesca is still there? I think she, oh, are you still there? Can you hear me, Francesca? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, it just blacked out and shut.
Okay.
Okay. Where did I stop at? So the objective is to identify the financial service provider and map the cash transfer related services that can be provided by this FSP at regional level. So how, just very quickly in terms of the structure of the National Cash Working Group in Somalia, we have the national level, which is chaired by myself together with WFP, and then we have sub-national cash working groups at state level currently, and it used to be a regional level last year, with the idea that they focus on coordination on the ground and identifying any gaps of partners that implement in those areas. And then we have the technical work streams, one of which is the financial service provider. So in terms of the methodology, the financial service provider led on the mapping of SSP in Somalia with the use of a quantitative online service and in coordination with all the cash working group sub-national chairs. Next slide, please. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Chris, over to the next slide.
Okay, great. So in terms of the Somalia context, so the Somalia context is relatively well studied and documented. We had a number of also recent studies conducted by GSMA, by the Altai consultancy funded by the World Bank that look at different FSP preference of communities, etc., and what's most relevant in country. However, there are low level of integration, for example, linkages with FSP and banking systems, and low levels of interoperability. It's only recent that with a telecom company, you can call a different telecom, and you cannot make mobile money transfer between different telecoms. Also, very limited regulations in place, government regulatory frameworks in particular in things like capital requirements, on data privacy, on anti-competitive practices, etc. There's definitely a strong desire for innovation. There is a constant discussion on how the service can be improved, and because of such high level of penetration of the network, how it can be made more user-friendly, but progress is limited. We've seen work on voice verification, which hasn't been implemented yet. Some work done on integration with certain payment systems, for example, with some UN payment systems, and a new application that came in very recently for for one of the main telecom companies. Overall, mobile money is pervasive, very cheap and well embedded for the customers. Somalia is one of the highest network penetration in the world, over 80% in urban areas and over 70% in rural areas. And transaction between, like mobile money transaction are free of charge apart from bulk payments. Mobile FSP are largely operate at regional monopolies. So it's been quite difficult for newcomers to come in. And there's a number of initiatives currently that look at improved cash systems. For example, the World Bank is funding research on data protection legislation, on unified social registry. Then we have cash donor groups, the Somali Cash Consortium, the federal government of Somalia and UN, with a number of initiatives that discuss initiative looking at cash systems in country. So in terms of findings and lesson learned, so as mentioned, mobile money is very cheap and accessible to pretty much anyone in country. So the need of hard cash, ATM, bank, etc. is very limited and used on a very small scale. Also, as mentioned earlier, there is very large regional monopolies that are fairly intact and haven't been, there's not been a lot of competition against them. Currently, there is no interoperability for mobile money. So different telecom you'll not be able to transfer money in between them. And only recently you can make calls between different service providers. This wasn't the case until a few years ago. A few new companies, Somto being one of them, are entering this domain and trying to disrupt the market, disrupt these monopolies, but it's very slow moving. And again, because there's no regulation cost, it's also very hard to have new spaces for this new service provider. Organizations are more and more looking into preference of beneficiaries in terms of usage of network. But again, because of these monopolies, it's very hard to change how it has been so far. Below there is a picture of, sorry, I cannot see, yeah, of the mapping that was done last year. I think more and more we just need to reflect on, for the case of Somalia particularly, the relevance of looking into all these different services and map them, because overall the vast both preference and usage from international actors is mobile money compared to bank transfer or cash in hand. So that's all from my side.
Okay, thank you so much, Francesca. And it's good to see the progress that has been done by the Somalia Cash Working Group in regards to FSP financial service provider mapping. And just to let you know that the Somalia financial service provider mapping was done, like, it was not necessarily funded as compared to the one for Yemen. So it's good to see at what extent and what scope, what can you do even with limited resources. So just to the question and answer segment. I'd just like to highlight some few questions here that have been asked. I think we can start with Robert Okiror. Is asking FSP mapping. Do you get the level of getting to know the cost of service / commission charged by FSPs? What is the feedback? What is the financial service providers' feedback on this? I think this question is directed to NISA. I think the timestamp, the time you're presenting, yeah. So.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, I think that's also the same question kind of as Yusuf Al-Mustafa asked. So no, we asked them about fees and their liquidity and also how they manage the fluctuating exchange rate in Yemen. And they just didn't really give an answer, and we didn't want to push them too much also for giving an answer. Mainly it was, they also didn't really say why they wouldn't want to answer. But I can imagine because they did answer all the other things, it mainly has to do with the fact that it's sensitive, it's too competitive. They don't want to share it for that reason. However, we asked the same question about fees to the humanitarian organizations through this survey. They could fill in themselves. So through this way, we were quite well able to see the fees per FSP, but then not from the FSPs themselves, but from the humanitarian organizations. And if there would have been more participation in that self-administrated survey, I think that overview of fees would have been pretty extensive and effective. So I think if your FSPs don't give the answer like the same as our FSPs did, then asking humanitarian organizations instead would be a way to go around it. Over to Dennis.
Okay, thank you so much for answering that. I think we have another question from Rehema Bashir. She's asking, can this methodology be used for different kind of project? For example, linking savings groups with financial service providers so that they're able to get loans. Nisa.
Thank you, Dennis. Potentially, it sounds pretty specific. So then maybe having a qualitative assessment like the one we did to some extent would work. But I guess if you have these village saving groups, it's a quite specific set of potential beneficiaries, and where we did like a big survey of many different beneficiaries, I would in this instance maybe do more focused group discussions instead of the approach that we had. But it's hard to say because I don't know too much about the objectives, of course. Over, Dennis.
Okay, I think another question, what about using some qualitative assessment in order to prepare the quantitative questionnaire, for e.g. for the comprehension of banks?
That's also for me, I think.
Yeah, that's for you.
In general, will be a very good practice to, whether it's a qualitative or quantitative survey, to always have a bit of a pilot survey where you would interview a few people to test out the tool. In practice for us, we were quite rushed, so unfortunately we didn't have time for that. I think the main problem with quantitative questionnaires is Yes, I think for true like a qualitative assessment, if we would pilot the tool, we would better be able to understand how we would have to fine tune terms, and then we could put this definition like more clear in the tool, in the survey itself. So yes, for sure. I think a main problem we had with the qualitative survey also is that because there's so many surveys, we don't perform these surveys ourselves. So it also means that you would have to train whoever's performing the survey for you very well, that he also has the same definition. And maybe he will train someone else, so that person should also have the same definition. So, I mean, it's a challenge, but both by including like clear definition in the tool and maybe having a really thorough training on and a glossary of what this means with each definition, hopefully that can be mitigated. Over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nisa. I think we're going to take, around 2 more questions or 3 before we go to the next segment. I think we'll take a question from Ibrahim Garba. He says, for Somalia, do you have report for the FSP mapping? What is the cash working group doing in breaking the monopoly? And I would like to know if the monopoly affects the service charge for transfers. I think that one is directed to you, Francesca.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thanks, Ibrahim. That's a very good question. So breaking it down a little, do you have report for the FSP mapping? Yes, this is available on the cash working group page, so feel free to check it out. What is the cash working group doing in breaking the monopoly? I mean, that's really not an easy thing to do, keeping in mind that, I mean, banking services have a very low penetration rate in Somalia. We're talking about 15% of the population, and about only 4% uses them. So often it's one of the few alternatives. And with such high penetration, it means you're also able to reach people in hard to reach areas and rural areas. In terms of the monopolies per se, like this regional division of these 3 main MNOs, there are some new competition coming in with extremely good rates, and that's starting to move the market. And that's really the first time we've seen in a long time new actors emerging in this realm. So indeed, it's affecting the transfer fees because they've been absolutely higher because of monopolies. But with these new actors, you're seeing also a reaction from the main companies in trying to be more competitive. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we're going to take another question. I think this time around, I think this one was during Yorgo's presentation. Basically, in terms of inclusive dialogue with stakeholders, how do we reconcile a situation whereby the collaborative approach could create an artificial or unfavorable market that gives room to non-competition in the market system? I think either Yorgos or Nisa can jump in on this one. Should I repeat the question?
Yes, please, Dennis.
Let me just go through the question again.
Sorry, what is the question?
Yeah, in terms of inclusive dialogue with stakeholders, how do we reconcile a situation whereby the collaborative approach could create an artificial or unfavorable market that gives room to non-competition in the market system?
Well, Lynn, the head of network, answers the question. I think I would answer the question more or less the same. And this is like a very relevant question in different contexts. especially when the FSPs identified are not numerous. So again, there have been quite a few occasions where organizations agreed to a threshold on the rates so that competition is limited up to a certain extent, so that fees cannot influence the general outreach to the general population. And also it has been on a number of cases where advocacy took place just to understand the reasons why such high rates took place.
Okay, thank you so much. It's good to hear also your perspective on this as well. So in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next presentation from Uganda. Then afterwards, we'll get to hear also perspectives from financial service provider themselves as well, having a representative here in the panel as well. So I think over to Dave, who's going to take us through the financial service provider assessment in Uganda. And after these two, we will take again the questions and answers. In case you don't manage to address all of them, we'll address them and share with them later after this webinar. But let's proceed to the next segment of this. Welcome, Dave. Dave is the research manager, REACH, in Uganda.
Thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. Yes, we also conducted a assessment of FSPs and cash and voucher assistance in Uganda. And maybe I should begin by acknowledging the support that we received also from our REACH colleagues elsewhere. And Lisa, I see, is on the call, and thank you for your presentation. In the design of our own assessment and the methodology of it. So maybe we can start. I will briefly talk about the background to the assessment and then the methodology, some of the challenges that we incurred and the lessons that we learned from them. And I hope that will be to the benefit of everybody else on the call today. Next slide, please. So as a background, the Uganda Cash Working Group, who we collaborated very closely with on this assessment, and in fact it was in support of the Cash Working Group and its agenda to develop a sort of a common approach to cash assistance in Uganda. So part of that process was, of course, a detailed mapping and an assessment of the FSPs. And actually it coincided with a already.
Sorry, let me just jump in a bit. Kindly speak slowly for the sake of
for the interpreters. Yes,
yeah.
I understand. So actually our assessment coincided with an effort by the Cash Working Group to already involve the FSPs and the private partners, private actors in ongoing discussions in the Cash Working Group. And that really greatly helped also us in the design of our research and the outreach to ensure the participation of these private actors, of course. Another, for people who are not super familiar with the Ugandan context, the financial service sector in Uganda is relatively well established if you compare it with some other countries in the region. But with some significant gaps that we knew from the data from the secondary literature review in terms of geographic coverage. Some areas have a much better developed financial service sector than others. So we knew that going in. And also, if you look at the range of digital financial service mechanisms, and that can be used also for the delivery of CVA, you can think of mobile money and prepaid cards and bank transfers and things like that. We knew that there was quite some capacity there. Next slide, please. So some of the research questions that we wanted to answer were similar, I think, to the Yemen presentation that we saw earlier. So looking at the capacity and the experience of financial service providers to deliver cash and voucher assistance through different delivery mechanisms. But we also wanted to know what is the experience currently of the humanitarian partners in working with different FSPs and in different locations. What are some of the risks and challenges? potential barriers to inclusion associated with the use of different delivery mechanisms and maybe the partnering with different financial service providers. And then what are the preferences of beneficiaries and what is their perception towards different delivery mechanisms, different FSPs. Next slide, please. So a little bit more on the methodology. We decided, because we were aware of these regional differences, that we wanted a sort of a localized approach to this assessment. We knew that, especially when we're considering challenges, obstacles to inclusion, perhaps, things like liquidity, also the presence of different FSPs would be vastly different between regions. So what we really wanted to ensure is that we were not interviewing, let's say, one bank or one mobile network operator at the national level in Kampala and then asking about, let's say, challenges in different parts of the country. We wanted to target branch offices in those locations to really understand the challenges in those areas. The other importance that we felt was to, then we heard it a few times in previous presentations as well, is to triangulate the information that we receive from financial service providers, also with the experience of, let's say, humanitarian partners, and also with beneficiary perspectives. So we thought that was very important in our methodology. Next slide, please. We came up then with a mixed methods approach, where we had a structured survey tool for financial service provider staff, and these were mainly branch level managers. And then we did semi-structured interviews with financial service provider agents. We felt it was very important, since the agent banking model is quite well developed and popular in Uganda. So we felt it was very important to speak to those agents and then make sure that they are often, especially in hard to reach areas or remote areas, the first line that interacts with beneficiaries receives complaints or challenges. So we thought it was important to interview those as well. We used key informant interviews for that. Then we also did key informant interviews with humanitarian partners implementing cash and voucher assistance. So you can think of program coordinators, monitoring and evaluation officers, that kind of stuff. And I'm losing the screen.
Hi, Chris.
Is it?
Yeah, thanks.
We're back. Okay. And then finally, we did key informant interviews with beneficiary representatives. And in Uganda, you have the Refugee Welfare Council that also includes, you have different levels, but you also include representatives for, let's say, persons with disabilities or women representatives, this kind of thing. So to get those perspectives as well was important. In total, we conducted about 180 interviews. 79 of them were structured interviews with FSP staff, and 101 were qualitative key informant interviews. Maybe last thing I should say about that was that data was collected in July and August last year. And that's important because we will get to the challenges, I think. Next slide, please. One of the biggest challenges that we had was that July and June coincided with a big spike in COVID cases in Uganda. And this meant that the country went into a full lockdown where movement was heavily restricted, and data collection in the settlement or in-person interviews were not possible. This affected us in several ways. We had to revert to phone interviews, of course, and participation engagement with the FSP was significantly, let's say, challenged by that. The tool was quite long, and you can imagine the FSP staff are people who have a normal working day. we're losing the screen again. They have a normal working day, and so asking them to take an hour and a half to go through a relatively long tool was quite difficult, but we managed ultimately. And then also the geographic coverage made it more difficult, because where previously we might have gone to the settlements and identified for ourselves the financial service providers that were active, and maybe neighboring urban centers, now we had to rely on the contacts that we had, snowball, sampling, purposive, asking other people to identify FSPs for us, and this certainly affected coverage to an extent. Now I should know these challenges by heart, but let me see if it's easy. I could share my screen, perhaps, Dennis. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Shall
Chris, are you there? Yeah, you can share. You can share. I think you can share the screen.
Let me see. Let me see. I think I will end up sharing my entire screen, which is probably not the best way, but let me, you could tell me if you see my screen.
Yes, you can see it. Just do the presentation view so that you can slideshow.
Yeah. So I think we have this.
It's okay.
Yeah, now we can see it. You can see it.
All right, I need to minimize you. So that was one of the challenges, was the remote data collection due to COVID restrictions. Another challenge that I felt was really challenging, but also interesting, was the need to create, if we had this structured approach and not qualitative, the need to create one tool that could apply to the different FSP types. We mentioned banks, microfinance institutions, mobile network operators, things like the savings and loans committees. This really was quite tough. It included a lot of complicated skip logics, and some of the questions, yeah, it was a challenge, certainly. One of the other challenges that we noticed was that this localized approach, where we spoke to branch managers in these different locations, also led to challenges, because we realized very early on in our data checking process that not all key informants seemed fully in the know on certain topics, especially speaking on pricing and even basic things like know your customer requirements. So essentially what we realized was that if you ask 4 branch managers in a bank what their pricing would be for a certain bulk transfer, you would get 4 different answers. And even when you ask them about their pricing model that they employ, even then you will get different answers. So that was a bit unexpected and a challenge. That ties in with the next challenge, was a lack of an ability. Of course, we were relying on FSPs to self-report certain data, especially when it comes to challenges, let's say with liquidity, but also pricing and these kind of things. And we do not have the capacity to really independently verify all of those responses. So that's a little bit of a challenge. But of course, we did try to triangulate, especially when it comes to things like challenges with liquidity. Okay, we're also asking on semi-structured tools, the agents, and we're also asking humanitarian partners, and we're also asking beneficiary representatives. So you do get a full picture in the end. And then finally, there was a reluctance on the part of some of the FSPs to share data that was considered sensitive, such as pricing, but also other questions. And this inhibited our reporting, because essentially, combined with the challenge of getting participation over the phone, and we resorted to saying, okay, we will not report in the report when it's about sensitive topics. We will not report the bank or the MNO or the particular name. We will report at the level of the type of FSP. So whether it's a bank, whether it's an MNO, or whether it's a microfinance institute, for example, but not go beyond that. Next slide, please. Oh, no, I'm doing it myself now. Apologies. Lessons learned. I would say if I had to do it again, or we could do it again, I would much prefer in-person over remote data collection that would allow for very nice GIS mapping of different FSPs, and especially their agents in the remote areas. You could have a very nice simple tool for agents that says what kind of services are they providing, who are they providing it for, GPS coordinates. It would be a very neat, I think, tool. And that brings me to the second bullet point, which is next time I would opt to split the tool into that information that you want to obtain on a local level. So maybe the challenges that you want to ask about, maybe the size of the agent networks, the type of presence that they have in certain areas. But then other data such as pricing, KYC requirements, experience in facilitating humanitarian cash transfers. You can ask that at a national level, maybe through a key informant qualitative tool, and obtain much more reliable data that way and have a nice conversation. So I would split those two tools and sort of go for a mix of the approach that we had now.
One minute.
Yeah.
1 minute.
All right. This is the last. This is the last slide. So in that sense, I think my last lesson learned would be the collaboration that we had with the cash working group in this was absolutely crucial to the success. The cash working group helped a lot in engaging the private sector, engaging the FSPs, and then sort of help pre-mapping so that the FSPs, so that we know more or less who and what type was around. And I would say in terms of doing another FSP assessment anywhere else, that is really crucial and ties in with what we've been hearing today. Which was the collaborative approach, I think. For me, that was it for my presentation. Thank you for listening. I'll take questions if there are any. Back to you, Dennis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dave, it's interesting to see the similarities and also the differences as well on this. Over the next, you're going just to get some perspective from financial service providers. I know this is a financial service provider mapping, so it's interesting to see and also to get to hear from financial service providers themselves. And we have a representative here from Crown Agents Bank and Kosi Moyo, who will be able to just give us a perspective on this before we wrap up. Welcome, Kosi.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, next slide, please. So I think just as a high-level intro, so I'm from Crown Agents Bank. I look after our payment solutions. We are a fairly old institution, almost 200 years old. Our core business is foreign currency, which is FX, and payments, cross-border payments. We currently support over 100 currencies across Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we are also working aggressively to grow our connections to mobile money wallets. So currently we have connections in about 14 countries. Next slide, please. So I think in terms of the topic that I'm talking through, I'll touch on a couple of areas. One, just to give you an idea of what we go through as a financial service provider when we receive and we are responding to an RFP. Our experience may differ to other FSPs, but there could possibly be some common areas. I'll also touch on some of the challenges that we face and where we think we could overcome some of the challenges if there is a certain level of collaboration. And then lastly, I'll just touch on a couple of areas in terms of where we've seen a couple of examples where we have seen collaboration work quite well. So in terms of our interaction with the various actors in the CVA space, it is usually through an RFI or RFP process, though we have regular discussions and meetings with some representatives of some of the organizations. In terms of the RFI, the request for information, or the RFP, the request for proposal, as an FSP, we look at it in terms of the technical capability and also the financial side of it, because usually the requests come through and they are split between technical requirements and the financial side, which covers the pricing details. From a technical perspective, the first step that we would normally go through is just to evaluate if we have the capability to deliver the solution that is required. And if we have, then we move on to the response. If we do not have the capability, we then look at whether we can work with other partners who could be other FSPs. So this could be other banks, it could be fintech entities or similar players, to see if we can jointly put forward a solution. So if we can address it directly or between us and a partner, we will then evaluate the financial side, just looking at, based on the information provided, which will be usually the volumes, the value of the payments, the number of payments. We try to estimate based on the level of pricing that we are going to put forward, just to get a sense of what will be the commercial or financial return for the organization. And then we go through an internal process just to say, to get that sign off to say, okay, technically we are fine, financially everything looks okay, please proceed. And then we go through several iterations of the proposal, so initial draft, and we keep revising until we address all the requirements. And just to highlight, there are cases where it may not make commercial sense for us to do a particular project with a client, but there may be a social impact benefit, and we feel that we want to participate. So it's not always about the money. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the challenges, and I've put quite a lot of detail on the slides, but in interest of time, I'll just give high-level overviews. The first challenge we face is just the difficulty in learning of the RFIs or RFPs that have been circulated. It comes through different, sometimes the customers will send directly to us. Sometimes we'll pick them up off a website. So there really is no consistent way of being aware that there's a requirement or a request for information or a request for a proposal. And I think from a FSP perspective, we just feel that if you as the actors in the space are not reaching all the FSPs, you may be missing out on certain solutions that could add value to you. the second point is around some of the tenders are very prescriptive in terms of the requirements. So we can go through a tender and it has a very rigid or set scoring system and a very set list of requirements, which in our view tends to limit the flexibility for an FSP to come through and maybe propose an alternative solution that may not be exactly what you are thinking of, but which could potentially add value to your program. The third challenge, sorry, next slide. The third challenge that we typically see is that I think it's the landscape that we are in is constantly changing in terms of solutions. Again, similar to the previous point, if a request comes through and the requirements are cast in stone, it's a bit difficult to highlight some of the options that are out there. So I think as FSPs, at times we think if there was flexibility around developing some level of proof of concept, so you are not necessarily committing to awarding a particular FSP a mandate, but you're working with the FSP to say, we have a problem, this is the problem. How do we find solutions to address this problem? I think you will probably find a number of FSPs who will be very happy to collaborate with you in terms of developing solutions, in terms of developing a proof of concept, testing it, refining it, and gradually, in a sense, building the next generation of solutions. Because I think if you look at it currently, a lot of it is driven by, even if you transfer funds to a beneficiary, there are a lot of challenges around liquidity. So it means there's a lot of cash that needs to be available in different locations, as an example. And that requires a lot of effort, it's a lot of cost, and the security risk associated with managing that cash. So when I talk of next generation solutions, I imagine a world where we have ecosystems that are not as dependent on cash as we are today. Probably the last point, just to highlight in terms of, I think the previous speakers also highlighted some questionnaires that went out to FSPs, and maybe the responses that came back were not as expected because the questions were quite lengthy. We tend to find that there are some extremely difficult RFPs to respond to, and it takes quite a lot of time and effort in terms of going through that particular RFP and trying to provide the responses as per the layout. I think generally if you look at it from an FSP perspective, my capabilities from a technical or operational perspective are pretty much the same. But the way I would, or the amount of time I would spend on different RFPs could vary from a couple of days on one to a month on another one because of the way they are structured. So again, we feel maybe there is some room for FSPs, for the various actors in the humanitarian space, just to look at the RFPs that are issued, try to see if there is best practice or in terms of whether it's templates, in terms of structure that could help to make the process easier.
Sorry, let me just cut you short a bit. Sorry, but you only have like, I think, 2 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, let me,
yeah, in the interest of time, yeah, thank you so much.
No, that's fine. And probably the last point on this slide is we do a lot of RFPs, and I think it's the same for other FSPs, but we do not get feedback on most of them. So even just to say we have concluded the evaluation, that doesn't really come through. So I think feedback would be quite useful. And probably last slide.
Chris, last
Sorry,
slide.
Dennis. Yeah. Or I can share it from my side if you.
Last, Chris, are you there? Yep, thank you.
Okay, so I think in terms of last slide, just a couple of examples of where, just to show some of the collaborations that we've been involved in, or some of the collaborations that we would love to do. Currently, we're spending a lot of time in Afghanistan. Challenging market where our view is that RFPs may not be the best option. So for example, through a collaboration, we've been able to assist the UN in terms of getting cash notes into the country. There are a lot of other challenges that we are working on in the background with various parties, such as our local banking partners, correspondent banks, some of the donor organizations. So we see a lot of value in collaboration. And probably one big area is around how can we collectively support the improvement in financial inclusion. I think there are some great solutions out there that could really help to bridge some of the gaps or challenges that we all collectively experience as we try to assist the beneficiaries in the various countries. Thank you, Dennis. I'll stop at this point.
Thank you so much, Nkosi, for that presentation. I think we'll just take a few questions before we do a wrap up. I'll start with Zozo. I'm going to allow you to speak. I'm going to unmute you. So kindly go ahead and ask your question. You can ask in whichever language, then we can get the interpretation.
You can unmute yourself, Zozo.
Maybe you can go to Adriana. Adriana, if you're there. Okay. Okay. Nathan, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I am from a service provider in Uganda, Equity Bank Uganda. And I participated in the exercise, and
we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Be more audible, or maybe move closer to the mic. I don't know.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I participated in the exercise, and one of the issues I noted and compared notes with my colleagues was the terminology used sometimes in terms of asking what is your fees. I was asked fees for cash deposit, which ordinarily is free, but when I queried, it was supposed to be for processing a payment, which attracts a fee. So of course that will, it by itself being, you'll get different responses from different staff in the same bank. So I think we would ask that in future, maybe this is tested, the questionnaire is tested, so that we can get, for uniformity of responses. Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know if Heba, are you around? Yeah, I see we have lots of hands, and I see we have lots of questions also in the Q&A section. We'll combine these questions and give answers and circulate after this webinar. And in the interest of time, I'll just like us to do a wrap up, since we are coming to the end of this, or maybe just do a wrap up of this webinar, and then we'll be able to compile all your questions and share them with you. I know that it's a very interesting topic and there are lots of questions. You can just post your question on the Q&A, and then you can be able to respond later. Sapenzi, over to you for the wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and thank you to all of you for participating today. And for the rich discussion, we see that there are a lot of questions in the Q&A, and there are a lot of questions that we did not get to. We will be, as Dennis said, developing a Q&A question, which we will share along with the recording of this webinar. So yeah, it has been great hearing about all the different perspectives on financial services providers mapping, and to learn about the different experiences. I would like to emphasize just 3 points, and one of them has to do with why. Why do we conduct financial services providers mapping? As we heard from one of the speakers, it could help to improve severe program design. It could help improve the reach and access of communities to cash and voucher assistance, very importantly, and it could also strengthen our coordination. And the second point that I would like to emphasize is on, which was mentioned by different speakers, was on the idea that successful mapping of financial services providers requires collaborative working. And that is not only between the 8 actors, but also between the 8 actors and financial service providers, and between both of the former and the communities that we serve. The third idea I would like to emphasize is on what the key elements of a successful mapping of FSPs or financial service providers should entail. And we have heard about mapping entailing the capacities, a mapping of the capacities of the existing financial service providers and the options that exist in a given context. We have heard about mapping what the regulatory environment is. We have heard about mapping the characteristics and preferences of the beneficiaries, and the potential risks of using the different delivery platforms on the recipients that receive cash and voucher assistance. So with this in mind, I would like to cover again just 3 takeaways from the discussions that we've had today. And the first one has to do with resources. So as it has been acknowledged, we can all appreciate that being able to carry out the level of in-depth mapping that was discussed requires resources. And as we all also know, or at least most of us know, cash working groups are the main mechanisms that have the ability to carry out these processes in a collaborative manner. And as we know, majority of the cash working groups are currently too poorly resourced to be able to carry out this kind of in-depth work. So I would like to just maybe take a pause here and underscore these points, and maybe call on the people on this call that are able to fund these kinds of initiatives to look at investing in them, because as we have seen, they have the potential to impact greatly on the quality and efficiency, on the quality of cash and voucher assistance in terms of efficiencies and effectiveness. The second point I would like to highlight is that cash working groups, as we have seen from the call today, cash working groups have carried out FSP mapping, but the approaches have differed depending on the amount of resources available to them, the time available to them, and why they are mapping. Sometimes these exercises are being done in situations of crisis. And so the lesson here is that even if a cash working group does not currently have the resources to carry out an in-depth assessment, there are certain aspects of mapping that they can already start working on to support the implementation of cash and voucher assistance. And this could still be beneficial, even if it's a simple step-up of the services that exist and the consumer behavior in that particular context, as we have seen from the Somalia example. And of course, many of the elements that we discussed today could apply to these kinds of mappings as well. The third and last point I would like to highlight is on how we work with financial service providers. And as we have seen, there's still so much to learn about how we work with financial service providers. One of the points that kept coming up throughout the webinar was on the benefits of collaboration and partnerships between aid actors and financial service providers. And this could really be useful in coming up with approaches that really work for and are suited for the context. We also know that there is a lot of interest from private sector actors, and by this I mean financial services, to work collaboratively with aid actors in this space, as we have heard from Nkosi and others, to address the capacity gaps that are currently seen. So I think looking at this idea of co-designing and co-implementation of cash responses together with private sector actors has benefits in terms of efficiencies and overall effectiveness, and it would be a good idea to explore. Although we also know that there are concerns from the aid actor side with regard to this arrangement that would need to be addressed. So maybe something to look at in the future. And so as I finish, I would like to say that this is an area that is fast evolving. There are, as we have seen, interesting ideas that we could pursue. So I will say that this is just the start of a conversation and on how we could mobilize and collaborate to address the issues at hand. And maybe just to mention, CALP is in the process of recruiting expertise in this area on digital payments and data responsibilities to help us do more in this area. So please watch the space. There will be more to come in the coming days. And so, I will stop here. I see that we ran out of time. Thank you once again for joining us today. Many thanks to all the speakers and the panelists. It has been a great pleasure, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.